The sound of metal biting through wood stopped me cold. 6 in the morning, and there was Karen Stewart standing on my property with an axe buried halfway through my eagle sculpture, the one I carved from my father's memory, wood chips scattered across the wet grass like confetti at a funeral. 72 hours, she said, waving some official-looking paper at me. Remove this unauthorized structure, or face $500 per day in fines. Her voice had that bureaucratic smugness I'd grown to hate, the kind that comes with a clipboard and zero common sense. I pulled my father's old rental receipt from my jacket pocket. Crumpled thing had been there for weeks, ever since I cleaned out his stuff. Never thought much about it until now. The paper felt thin between my fingers, like it might dissolve if I looked at it wrong. This is my property, Karen. According to the Homeowners Association covenant, any structure over 18 inches requires prior approval. She yanked the axe free with a grunt. More chips flew. This monstrosity violates Section 4B. If you've ever watched someone destroy something you poured your heart into, you know that hollow feeling in your chest, like someone reached in and squeezed. That eagle took me 3 months to carve. Every feather, every detail. Dad would have loved it. You can't just... I can and I will. Karen's smile had all the warmth of a tax audit. Emergency Homeowners Association meeting tonight, 7 sharp, don't be late. The smell of fresh sawdust hung in the air as she walked away, her heels clicking against the concrete like a countdown timer. I stood there holding that receipt, wondering what the hell Dad had gotten me into. See, here's the thing about small-town politics. It's never really about the rules, it's about power. And Karen Stewart had been drunk on it ever since she got elected president of our little neighborhood kingdom. 3 years of nitpicking every mailbox, every garden gnome, every blade of grass that dared grow an inch too tall. But something about that receipt nagged at me. Dad never kept paperwork unless it mattered. The man threw away birthday cards but saved utility bills from 1987. This thing said, guest cabin rental agreement in faded blue ink. I walked over to the small building behind my house. Hadn't paid it much attention before, just storage, I figured, tools and Christmas decorations. But looking at it now, with the morning light hitting the windows just right, it looked more substantial than I remembered. The door was locked. Of course it was. My phone buzzed. Text message from my daughter Sarah, away at college. Dad, saw the neighborhood Facebook group. What's this about you ignoring community rules? People are saying you're being stubborn again. Again. Like I had a history of picking fights with the Homeowners Association. Like I enjoyed having my morning coffee interrupted by middle-aged dictators with legal documents. I texted back, it's complicated. Her response came immediately. Fix it. I don't need my friends seeing my dad's drama online. That's when I knew Karen had already won the first round. The court of public opinion was in session, and I was the defendant who didn't even know he was on trial. The eagle sculpture looked smaller now, violated. Karen's axe had split right through the wing section. Months of work, and she'd destroyed it in 30 seconds. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. This wasn't about building codes or property values. This was about breaking me down, piece by piece. I walked back to the guest cabin and tried the door again, still locked. But as I jiggled the handle, I noticed something carved into the wood near the frame. Tiny letters weathered by years of rain and sun. Studio number 3. Studio? Dad had been a mechanic his whole life. Grease under his fingernails, oil stains on his shirts. What would he need with an art studio? That night, I walked into the elementary school cafeteria where we held our monthly neighborhood meetings. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. The smell of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee filled the air. 15 people showed up. In a neighborhood of 60 houses, that was actually impressive turnout. Karen stood at the front with a presentation board, looking like she was about to announce quarterly earnings. Before we begin, she said, I want everyone to see what we're dealing with. She flipped the board around. There was my eagle, photographed from below at a dramatic angle that made it look menacing, like it was about to swoop down and carry off small children. This unauthorized sculpture has been reported by multiple residents as an eyesore that diminishes property values, Karen continued. The owner has been notified, but refuses to comply with community standards. Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over raised her hand. It looks dangerous. Exactly my concern, Karen nodded. What if it falls? What if a child gets hurt? The liability alone could bankrupt our association. I stood up. Every head in the room turned toward me like I just confessed to a crime. That eagle is on my property. It's not hurting anyone. The covenant clearly states, I don't care what the covenant states. The words came out harder than I intended. My father just died. That sculpture is his memorial. You want to tear it down over 18 inches? The room went quiet. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to pause their buzzing. For a moment, I thought maybe human decency would win out. Then Karen cleared her throat. I understand your loss, she said with practiced sympathy. But grief doesn't exempt anyone from community rules. All in favor of requiring immediate removal? 15 hands went up, every single one. The vote was unanimous, against me. I walked out into the parking lot, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. My phone was already buzzing with notifications. The neighborhood Facebook group was lighting up with posts about the sculpture controversy, anonymous accounts sharing pictures of my house, my truck, my mailbox. One post read, "Selfish neighbor thinks rules don't apply to him." Another, "Setting a bad precedent. What's next? Junk cars in the front yard?" By the time I got home, I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Friends, neighbors, even my ex-wife wanting to know what the hell I was thinking. But the worst part? The very worst part was walking past that wounded eagle, seeing the gash Karen's axe had left in the wing. Dad's memorial, broken and bleeding sawdust onto the ground. That's when I knew this wasn't just about property values or community standards. This was war, and Karen Stewart had just fired the first shot. The bills started arriving the next morning, $500 per day, just like Karen promised. Bright yellow envelopes with "violation notice" stamped across the front in angry red letters. I set my coffee cup down and did the math. If this dragged on for a month, I'd be looking at $15,000 in fines. My construction business was doing okay, but not okay enough to flush that kind of money down the drain. My phone rang before I could finish the calculation. "Dad?" Sarah's voice sounded strained. "My roommate just showed me something." "What now?" "Someone posted a video of our house on TikTok. It's got like 3,000 views already. They're calling you Sculpture Dad and making jokes about suburban rebels." I closed my eyes. The internet. Of course it had gone viral. Nothing stayed local anymore. "The comments are brutal, Dad. People are saying you're entitled, that you think you're above the law. There's even a hashtag, Sculpture Dad." "Sarah, I can explain." "Can you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're having a midlife crisis and taking it out on the neighbors." The line went dead, my own daughter hanging up on me. I walked outside to check on the eagle. Someone had tied yellow caution tape around it during the night. "Pending removal," signs stabbed into the ground like tiny grave markers. The sculpture looked like a crime scene now. Mrs. Patterson from next door was walking her dog. She saw me and immediately changed direction, pulling the poor animal across the street like I was radioactive. That's when I noticed the cars, 3 of them, parked across from my house with their occupants just sitting there, watching. One guy had a camera with a telephoto lens. "Can I help you?" I called out. The photographer rolled down his window. "Tom Brennan, Channel 7 News. We're doing a story on neighborhood disputes. Care to comment?" "Get off my street." "Public road, sir. First Amendment rights." I turned around and walked back into the house, but I could feel their eyes on me. The whole thing was spiraling out of control, and I hadn't even fought back yet. The doorbell rang around noon. Karen Stewart stood on my porch with a man in an expensive suit. He looked like the kind of lawyer who charged by the minute. "This is Mr. Morrison from the city attorney's office," Karen announced. "He's here to discuss your compliance options." Morrison stepped forward with a briefcase that probably cost more than my truck. "Sir, I'm authorized to offer a settlement, remove the structure voluntarily, pay current fines, and will consider the matter closed." "How much?" $1,500 plus removal costs. I laughed, actually laughed right in their faces. "You want me to pay you to tear down my father's memorial?" "The alternative is daily fines until you comply," Morrison said. His voice had all the emotion of a parking meter. "Those can add up quickly." Karen smiled that predatory smile again. "We're being generous, Tom. Don't let pride make this worse." After they left, I walked out to the guest cabin again. That Studio Summer 3 carving was still bothering me. I'd tried calling Dad's old friends, but none of them knew anything about an art studio. Jim Murphy, who'd worked with Dad for 30 years, said he'd never seen the man draw so much as a stick figure. But that rental receipt in my pocket told a different story. The paper was dated 1987, signed by someone named R. Henderson as landlord. Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who'd voted to tear down my eagle last night. I knocked on her door around 3 o'clock. She answered with that nervous smile people get when they're caught in a lie. "Oh, hello, Tom. Terrible business with the sculpture. Mrs. Henderson, I found something that belonged to my father, an old rental agreement for the cabin behind my house. It's signed by someone with your last name." Her face went white. That would be my late husband, Richard. He used to rent out small spaces to local artists, before the Homeowners Association, of course. Artists? Nothing fancy, painters, woodworkers, that sort of thing. Your father rented the space for almost 20 years, never caused any trouble. 20 years. Dad had been running an art studio for 20 years and never told me. The man who complained about wasting money on greeting cards had been paying rent on a creative space for 2 decades. What did he do in there? Mrs. Henderson glanced around like Karen might be watching from the bushes. Woodworking mostly, beautiful pieces. He made a rocking chair for my grandson's nursery. And those wind chimes that used to hang from the oak tree? Your father carved those. Wind chimes. I remembered those. They'd disappeared after Dad moved into the nursing home. I'd assumed the weather got them. Mrs. Henderson, if my father had a legal right to use that studio, wouldn't that change things with the sculpture? Oh dear. She wrung her hands like she was trying to squeeze water from them. I don't know about legal matters. Richard handled all that. The papers might still be in the county office, but that was so long ago. She was scared. I could see it in her eyes. Karen Stewart had these people so terrified of stepping out of line that they wouldn't even acknowledge their own history. That evening, I drove to Murphy's Tavern downtown. If you wanted straight answers in a small town, you didn't go to City Hall. You went to the bar where people's tongues got loose and their memories got sharp. Jim Murphy was nursing a beer at his usual spot. 50 years of construction work had bent his back and gnarled his hands, but his mind was still sharp as a tack. "Jim, tell me about my father and art." He nearly choked on his beer. "Art? Eddie? You sure we're talking about the same guy?" Someone told me he rented a studio space, made furniture, wind chimes, that kind of thing. Jim's expression changed. He looked around the bar, then leaned in close. "Your dad made me promise never to tell you boys about his hobby." "Why?" "Said it was his escape, his one thing that didn't involve fixing engines or dealing with customers. He was actually pretty good at it." Jim pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photos. "Made this for my wife's birthday 3 years ago." The photo showed an intricate jewelry box, carved from cherry wood, with delicate roses etched into the lid. It was beautiful. Museum quality, beautiful. He made that? That and about 50 other pieces over the years. Your dad had real talent, Tom. Artist's hands hidden under all that motor oil. I stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the man who'd raised me with this secret creator. Dad had always been practical, no nonsense, focused on function over form, but here was proof he'd been living a double life. Jim, if he had a legitimate studio, legally rented for 20 years, would that matter for the sculpture dispute? Hell, I don't know about legal stuff, but I'll tell you this much. Eddie paid his rent on time every month, kept detailed records of everything he made, and treated that little cabin like it was sacred ground. Sacred ground. Maybe that's exactly what it was. I drove home through streets that felt different now. Hostile. Every house seemed to have eyes watching from behind curtains. The yellow caution tape around my eagle fluttered in the evening breeze like surrender flags. But I wasn't surrendering. Not yet. The real war was just beginning, and I was finally starting to understand what weapons my father had left me. The county records office smelled like dust and broken dreams. Fluorescent lights flickered over rows of filing cabinets that probably hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. The clerk behind the desk looked like she'd been there just as long. "I need to see rental agreements from 1987, I told her. Property records for 412 Maple Street. She squinted at me through glasses thick enough to start fires. "That'll take some digging. What's this about?" "Legal dispute. My father rented a studio space for 20 years. I need proof. 20 years? She perked up like I'd just told her lottery numbers. That's practically unheard of in this town. Most people can't commit to a gym membership that long. While she disappeared into the maze of files, I sat in a plastic chair that had seen better decades and thought about Dad's secret life. All those evenings he'd claimed to be working late at the shop, tinkering with customer cars. Turns out he'd been creating beautiful things instead of just fixing broken ones. My phone buzzed. Text from Sarah. Dad, please just take down the sculpture. This is embarrassing. Another buzz. Unknown number. Saw your house on the news. You're what's wrong with America. And then another. Entitled boomer thinks rules don't apply to him. The internet had decided I was the villain in this story. Suburban Karen versus stubborn sculptured dad. Guess which role I'd been cast in. Found something interesting, the clerk announced, returning with a manila folder, thick as a phone book. Your father was quite the documenter. She spread the papers across the counter like she was dealing cards, rental agreements, receipts, even photographs of Dad's work. 20 years of monthly payments, never late, never disputed. But the real treasure was buried in the middle of the pile. A business license dated 1987 for Henderson Artisan Studios. It listed 3 rental units, including the cabin behind my house, as Studio North 3 Residential Artist Workspace. This is huge, I whispered. Gets better, she said, flipping to another document. See this zoning variance from 1985? It specifically allows commercial artistic activity in designated residential structures. Your father's cabin is grandfathered under the old county rules. Grandfathered, the magic word that made HOA busybodies wake up in cold sweats. I drove home feeling like I'd just found buried treasure. Karen Stewart might have the neighborhood terrorized, but she didn't have the law on her side. Not this time. The yellow tape around my eagle was gone when I pulled into the driveway. In its place stood a man in coveralls with "City Demolition" stenciled across his back. He was measuring the sculpture with a tape measure and making notes on a clipboard. "Excuse me," I called out. "What are you doing?" "It's scheduled removal," he said without looking up. "Got the work order right here." He showed me an official document signed by Karen Stewart as HOA president. Authorization for immediate removal of hazardous unauthorized structure. The demolition was set for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. "You can't do this. The matter's still under dispute." "It's sorry, buddy. I just follow orders. City says remove it, I remove it." That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Jim Murphy and 2 other guys from Dad's old crew. We gathered in my garage, drinking beer, and staring at the folders full of documents spread across my workbench. "So, let me get this straight," said Pete Kowalski, Dad's former partner. "Eddie was paying rent on an art studio for 20 years, and it's legally zoned for commercial creative work?" "That's right, which means any art created in that studio has legal protection under the original zoning variance." "But the sculpture isn't in the studio," Jim pointed out. "It's in your yard." "Doesn't matter. The variance covers artistic works created within or displayed upon the designated premises." I looked it up. The whole property qualifies. Pete whistled low. "Karen's gonna blow a gasket when she finds out." "That's the plan." But first, I needed to get inside that studio. Dad's old keys were somewhere in the house, buried in the boxes of his belongings I'd been avoiding since the funeral. Time to stop running from his memory and start embracing it. I found the keys in a cigar box tucked behind his work shirts. 3 keys on a ring shaped like a tiny hammer. The smallest one fit the studio door like it had been waiting for me. The smell hit me first. Cedar shavings and linseed oil, the scent of creativity and patience. Dad's workshop was nothing like the cluttered garage where he'd fixed cars. This space was organized, purposeful, almost reverent. Tools hung in perfect rows along pegboard walls. Hand planes, chisels, carving knives arranged like surgical instruments. A workbench worn smooth by decades of use dominated the center of the room. And everywhere, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to understanding, were photographs of Dad's work. Jewelry boxes, picture frames, decorative bowls, a chess set with pieces carved to look like construction workers, a nativity scene where Joseph wore coveralls and Mary had calloused hands. This wasn't hobby craft store nonsense. This was art. Real art, created by the man who'd raised me to believe practical was the only thing that mattered. In the corner stood a half-finished sculpture, an eagle, wings spread wide, caught in the moment between earth and sky. My father had been carving another eagle when he got sick, the same eagle I'd completed and placed in his memory. A folder on the workbench contained business cards for Edward Chen, artisan woodworker. My father had been selling his pieces quietly for years. The folder held receipts for hundreds of sales, tax documents, even letters from satisfied customers thanking him for wedding gifts and memorial pieces. He'd been living a double life, and I'd never suspected a thing. The sound of car doors slamming outside broke my concentration. Through the studio window, I could see Karen Stewart marching across my lawn with two men in suits. The cavalry was arriving for tomorrow's demolition, probably doing a final inspection. I grabbed the most important documents, the zoning variance, the business license, the rental agreements, and stuffed them into Dad's old briefcase. Then I locked the studio and walked outside to meet them. "Tom," Karen called out with false sweetness, "just wanted to make sure you understood about tomorrow's removal. 8 a.m. sharp. I'd hate for you to be caught off guard." "Actually, Karen, I think you're the one who's about to be caught off guard." I opened the briefcase and pulled out the zoning variance. Her smile faltered as she read the first few lines. This can't be right." Henderson Artisan Studios, established 1985, grandfathered commercial artistic zoning. My father rented studio number 3 for 20 years. Legal, documented, and fully protected under County Ordinance 847B. One of the suited men, probably her lawyer, grabbed the document and started reading faster. His face went pale. "Ma'am," he whispered, "if this is legitimate, we may have a problem." Karen snatched the paper back, her eyes scanning the official seals and signatures like she was looking for forgeries. But county documents don't lie, especially when they're 40 years old and signed by half the town council. "This doesn't change anything," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "The sculpture still violates current HOA regulations. Current regulations can't supersede grandfathered zoning rights. The sculpture was created in a legally designated artistic workspace and is displayed on property covered by the original variance. Your demolition order is invalid." The lawyer was already on his phone, probably calling someone at the city office to verify my claims. Karen stood there clutching the document like it might spontaneously combust and solve her problems. "We'll see about this," she finally managed. But as they walked away, I could see the defeat in her posture. For the first time since this whole mess started, Karen Stewart wasn't sure she was going to win. And tomorrow's demolition? Something told me those city workers were going to get a very interesting phone call tonight. Sunrise found me sitting on the front porch, briefcase at my side, watching the street for the city demolition crew. A low mist clung to the ground, turning every footstep into a wet slap. My hands shook, not from fear, but from a cocktail of exhaustion and adrenaline. You ever notice how a fight drags on longer than you thought possible? 8 a.m. sharp, the demolition truck rumbled up and parked by the curb. The driver stepped out, looked at me, then checked his paperwork twice. Behind him, Karen Stewart and her lawyer hovered by the mailbox, watching every move. I walked straight out, papers in hand. They expected a scene, maybe a showdown with yelling and threats. Instead, I handed the driver the zoning variance, the business license, the rental agreement. I'm protected. My father's studio rights still stand. These fines, all of this, is based on an HOA rule that doesn't override county law. He called his supervisor, voice low but tense. "I got a guy here with documents, legit-looking old stuff. What do we do?" 5 minutes of waiting. The air smelled of damp grass, diesel, and Karen's perfume, sickly sweet, mixing with the morning cold. Finally, he shrugged. "Work order revoked. We're out." The truck roared away before Karen could say a word. I thought that would be the end. I really did. Turns out Karen was only warming up. She stormed over, face tight and red with frustration. "You think you're clever, Tom? This isn't over. I'll have the whole board review your case. You want to fight? I'll turn up the heat." She posted about me online before noon, calling me a manipulator, a liar, a threat to neighborhood peace. Neighbors chimed in. "He always wanted special treatment. He's ruining our community spirit." Calls dropped off for my business. 2 regular clients canceled in the same afternoon. I watched my income evaporate while my reputation tarnished with every ping. Sarah texted, "Dad, why are you making it worse?" Her disappointment cut deeper than any fine. The day dragged on. I retreated into Dad's studio, hoping for comfort in cedar and memory. But even that safe space felt invaded. Outside, I heard Mrs. Henderson talking to someone on the sidewalk, worried whispers about Tom's stubbornness. Mid-afternoon, Jim Murphy came by. His knock had the weight of concern, a metal-on-wood rap that resonated through the quiet house. "Anything I can do?" He set a six-pack on the workbench, hands thick and steady. "Unless you can tell me how to make people see sense, Jim, I'm fresh out of ideas." Jim gave a low laugh. Sense isn't popular these days. We sat in silence, beer untouched. Sometimes you learn more from what people don't say. Then, as if the universe wanted to keep me off balance, my phone lit up with a message from a past customer. "Heard about the drama. If you're doing a sale, let me know. Folks love your work." The smallest flicker of hope cut through the fog. Outside, Karen circled the street in her silver SUV. She slowed, rolled down her window. "Enjoy your hollow victory, Tom. The board meets tonight. There's still time to do the right thing and take it down yourself." Her words snapped like winter air. "Funny, Karen," I said. "If you believe so much in the law, you wouldn't need to break it to win." She sped off, taillights blinking in the haze. I wondered about all the little wars happening in neighborhoods everywhere, how people lose their way fighting for control. Sundown brought restless quiet. I sat under the porch light, eagle sculpture safe but surrounded by silence. The only sound was the distant chorus of crickets and the sharp click of my daughter's angry voicemail. What would you do if the place you called home turned against you overnight? I wiped my hands on my jeans and stared into the dark, waiting for the next move I knew was coming. The emergency HOA meeting notice arrived in my mailbox at 7 a.m. Karen had called it for the same evening, citing urgent community safety concerns and legal review of property violations. The wording made my stomach clench like a fist. By noon, I understood why she'd moved so fast. Mrs. Henderson appeared at my door, wringing her hands and avoiding eye contact. Behind her stood a man in a county inspector's uniform, clipboard in hand and bureaucratic certainty in his eyes. "Tom," Mrs. Henderson whispered, "I'm so sorry. They made me." The inspector stepped forward. "Sir, we have received complaints about unpermitted commercial activity on residential property. I need to examine your guest cabin and any associated business operations." Karen had found her angle. If she couldn't attack the sculpture directly, she'd go after the studio that protected it. "Ma'am," the inspector said to Mrs. Henderson, "you confirmed that commercial rent was collected from this property for 20 years without proper permits?" She nodded miserably. "My husband handled the paperwork. I assumed everything was legal. Commercial activity in a residential zone requires specific permits, regardless of grandfathered artistic zoning. If Mr. Chen's father was operating a business without proper licensing, that changes everything." My heart dropped to my boots. The inspector was right, and Karen knew it. Dad's artistic zoning protected the studio space, but not necessarily commercial sales from that space. The receipts I'd found showing his furniture sales could be turned against me. "I need to see your father's business records, tax filings, and any evidence of commercial transactions," the inspector continued. I handed over Dad's folder, watching 20 years of meticulous record-keeping become the rope to hang me with. The inspector flipped through purchase orders, customer receipts, even thank you letters from satisfied buyers. This clearly shows commercial activity. Without proper permits, this constitutes a violation that could void the artistic zoning protection. Karen appeared from around the corner of the house, no longer bothering to hide her satisfaction. "I tried to handle this quietly, Tom. You forced my hand." That evening's meeting was a massacre. The elementary school cafeteria filled with more neighbors than I'd ever seen at an HOA gathering. Word had spread. The guy who thought he was above the rules was finally getting his comeuppance. Karen had prepared a presentation that would have made corporate lawyers proud. Photos of Dad's studio, copies of his sales records, testimony from Mrs. Henderson about 20 years of unreported commercial activity. Not only did the previous owner operate an illegal business, Karen announced to the packed room, but Mr. Chen is now using that same illegal operation to claim protection for his unauthorized sculpture. The crowd murmured agreement. I sat in the back, feeling like a defendant at his own trial. Furthermore, Karen continued, the county inspector has determined that any zoning protection based on illegal commercial activity is null and void. The sculpture must be removed immediately. Hands shot up around the room. This sets a terrible precedent, called out Bob Martinez from Elm Street. If we let this slide, what's next? Everyone claiming artistic protection? Property values, added Janet Fisher. My house is already hard enough to sell. I stood up, legs unsteady beneath me. My father paid his taxes. Every penny of income from his work was reported to the IRS. Taxes don't equal permits, Karen shot back. Operating a business without proper licensing is still illegal, regardless of tax compliance. She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. Dad had been honest about his income, but hadn't navigated the bureaucratic maze of commercial permits. In a small town in 1987, who would have? The vote was swift and brutal. 32 in favor of immediate removal, 3 abstentions, 0 opposed. Even Mrs. Henderson, guilt written across her face, raised her hand against me. Walking to my truck afterward, I heard the whispers behind me. Finally got what he deserved. Thought he was so smart. Should have just followed the rules like everyone else. At home, the eagle looked different in the porch light. Still beautiful, still a tribute to Dad's memory. But now, it felt like a monument to my own stubborn pride. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe I should have just taken it down from the beginning. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Dad, please, just end this. It's not worth it anymore. She was right too. The fines would bankrupt me, the legal fees would finish the job, and my reputation in town was already destroyed. Karen had won by finding the one flaw in Dad's otherwise perfect records. I sat on the porch steps, holding that old rental receipt that had started everything. The paper felt fragile now, like touching it wrong might make it crumble to dust. But something nagged at me about Mrs. Henderson's testimony. She'd said her husband handled all the paperwork. Richard Henderson, the man who'd rented to Dad for 20 years. The same Richard Henderson who'd signed that business license I'd found at the county office. If he'd approved the artistic studios in the first place, would he really have overlooked commercial permits for 20 years? I pulled out my phone and called the county records office. The same clerk who had helped me before answered, sounding tired but willing to help. I need to know about Richard Henderson, I said. Specifically, what other permits or licenses he might have filed in connection with Henderson Artisan Studios. That's going to require another file search. What exactly are you looking for? Anything that might show he knew about commercial activity and approved it officially. She sighed. I'll check tomorrow morning. But Mr. Chen, maybe it's time to let this go. Sometimes fighting City Hall just isn't worth it. After I hung up, I sat in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of a neighborhood that no longer wanted me. Tomorrow would bring new fines, new legal challenges, maybe even criminal charges for the commercial violations. Karen Stewart had played the game better than me, and now I was facing complete defeat. But something about giving up felt like betraying Dad's memory all over again. He'd spent 20 years quietly creating beautiful things, and I'd be damned if I'd let that legacy disappear without one last fight. Even if that fight destroyed everything I had left. The county clerk called at 8 a.m, voice tight with excitement. Mr. Chen, you need to get down here. I found something that changes everything. I dressed quickly, hands shaking as I buttoned my shirt. Outside, Karen's silver SUV was parked across the street again, like she was keeping vigil over her victory. She waved at me through the windshield, all smiles and fake friendliness. The records office felt different this time. The clerk led me to a back room where she'd spread documents across a large table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Richard Henderson wasn't just renting studio space, she said. He was running a county-approved artist collective. Look at this. She handed me a folder marked Henderson Arts Cooperative, 1985-2005. Inside were permits, tax documents, and correspondence with the county planning department. Richard Henderson had been operating a legitimate small business incubator for local artists. Your father wasn't just a tenant, the clerk continued. He was a registered member of an officially sanctioned arts cooperative. All commercial sales were pre-approved under the collective's business license. I stared at the papers, hardly believing what I was reading. This means your father's commercial activity was completely legal. The The cooperative handled all permits, licensing, and tax obligations for its members. Karen Stewart either didn't know about this, or she knew and hoped you wouldn't find out. The drive home felt like floating. For the first time in weeks, I had ammunition instead of just stubborn pride. But as I pulled into my driveway, I saw something that made my blood freeze. 2 city trucks were parked in front of my house. Workers in hard hats were setting up barriers around the eagle sculpture. Karen stood on the sidewalk with her lawyer and the county inspector, watching them work. "What's going on?" I demanded. The inspector looked uncomfortable. "Emergency removal order. Safety concerns raised about structural integrity after yesterday's inspection." "You inspected my sculpture yesterday?" "While you were at the records office this morning," Karen said sweetly. "Amazing what a thorough examination can reveal. Dry rot, insect damage, potential for collapse. Public safety trumps everything else." I looked at the eagle. It was solid cedar, treated and sealed, maybe the strongest thing on my entire property. But the inspector's report would say whatever Karen needed it to say. "You can't do this. I have new evidence about the commercial permits." "Too late," Karen's lawyer interjected. "The emergency order supersedes any permit disputes. Public safety is non-negotiable." I watched them prep the crane that would lift Dad's memorial away forever. The workers moved efficiently, professionally, like they'd done this 100 times before. Just another day destroying someone's life. That's when I remembered something Mrs. Henderson had said, about her husband handling all the paperwork, about how careful he'd been with documentation. If Richard Henderson was as thorough as his record suggested, maybe there was something else. I called Mrs. Henderson from my porch, watching the crane swing into position. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask about your husband's files. Did he keep personal records separate from the county paperwork?" "Oh yes, dear. Richard kept everything. There are boxes in our attic going back 40 years. Why?" "Can I look through them? Today? It's urgent." An hour later, I was climbing into Mrs. Henderson's dusty attic, flashlight in hand and desperation in my heart. Cardboard boxes lined the rafters, each one labeled in Richard Henderson's precise handwriting. Henderson Arts Cooperative, Personal Files, was buried behind Christmas decorations and old photo albums. Inside, I found the treasure I'd been hoping for. Richard Henderson hadn't just run a legitimate arts cooperative. He'd documented everything, including detailed photographs of all his member artists' work. And there, in a photo dated 1995, was my father standing next to an intricately carved eagle. The same eagle that was about to be destroyed in my front yard. But more importantly, the photo was part of a county arts newsletter celebrating local artisans and their contributions to community culture. My father's eagles weren't just commercial products. They were recognized as culturally significant folk art. The newsletter included a quote from the county cultural commissioner. "Edward Chen's eagles represent the finest tradition of American folk sculpture. These works deserve preservation as examples of our region's artistic heritage." Cultural heritage protection. It was a long shot, but it might be the only shot I had left. I called the State Cultural Preservation Office from Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, explaining the situation while watching through her window as the crane positioned itself over my sculpture. "If the work has documented cultural significance and is facing destruction, you can file an emergency heritage preservation claim," the officer told me. "But you need photographic evidence and official documentation." "I have both." "Then fax everything immediately. If approved, it creates an automatic 30-day moratorium on any destruction while we conduct a formal review." I sent the documents from Mrs. Henderson's old fax machine, numbers blurring together in my haste. Outside, the crane operator was testing his equipment, hydraulics whining and diesel engines rumbling. My phone rang 15 minutes later. "Mr. Chen, this is Maria Santos from the State Cultural Office. Your emergency claim has been approved. I'm calling the city right now to halt any demolition activities." Through the window, I watched the crane operator answer his phone, then climb down from his equipment. He walked over to Karen and her lawyer, shaking his head and pointing at his phone. Karen's face went from confusion to rage in the space of a heartbeat. She started yelling, waving her arms, but the workers were already packing up their equipment. The eagle stood untouched, protected by the same government bureaucracy that Karen had tried to use against me. I walked outside as the trucks pulled away. Karen stood on the sidewalk, hands clenched into fists. watching her victory slip away. "This isn't over," she called out. 30 days, that's all you bought yourself." Maybe so, but 30 days was time enough to mount a real defense, time to rally support from people who understood the difference between rules and right. Time to show this neighborhood what my father had really created, and why it mattered more than Karen Stewart's need for control. The war wasn't won yet, but the battlefield had shifted in my favor. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I wasn't fighting alone. The 30-day Heritage Review period gave me something I hadn't had since this whole mess started. Time to think clearly, time to plan, and time to discover just how deep Karen's deception ran. 3 days after the emergency preservation order, I was organizing Dad's studio when I found a box I'd missed before. Inside were letters between my father and Richard Henderson, dating back to 1985. Not business correspondence, but personal notes between friends who shared a love of craftsmanship. One letter stopped me cold. Richard, writing to Dad about his concerns that certain board members were trying to eliminate the arts cooperative to make room for more profitable development opportunities. The letter was dated 2003, just 2 years before Richard's death. "Karen's been pushing to dissolve the cooperative since she joined the planning committee," Richard had written. "She wants the studio spaces rezoned for commercial retail. Claims art doesn't generate enough tax revenue." Karen had been planning this for over 20 years. My sculpture wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the last obstacle to her vision of turning our neighborhood into a strip mall. I called an emergency meeting with Jim Murphy and Pete Kowalski at the studio. When they saw the letters, Pete whistled low. "That woman's been playing a long game," he said. "Your dad's eagle was just the excuse she needed to finally kill the whole cooperative." "But why now?" I asked. Jim pointed to a document I'd overlooked, a development proposal for Henderson Village Shopping Center. Karen's name was listed as a consulting partner with the development company. "She stands to make a fortune if this goes through," Jim said, "but not if there's protected art space in the way." The final HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday night. Karen had called it to permanently resolve the sculpture issue once the Heritage Review expired. She'd stacked the deck with supporters, registered new voters, even recruited residents from neighboring districts who had no business voting on our neighborhood issues. But I had something she didn't expect: the truth, and people who finally understood what was really at stake. Saturday evening, the school cafeteria filled beyond capacity. But this time, it wasn't just angry neighbors demanding my sculpture's removal. Word had spread about Karen's development deal, and longtime residents who'd stayed quiet were finally speaking up. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, clutching photographs of her husband with Dad and other cooperative artists. Behind her sat dozens of people holding pieces of Dad's work: jewelry boxes, picture frames, carved birds, decorative bowls. They'd brought 20 years of beauty into that sterile room. Karen took the podium with her usual confidence, but I could see tension in her shoulders. "Tonight, we end this circus. The Heritage Review found no grounds for permanent protection. The sculpture comes down tomorrow." She wasn't wrong. The state review had concluded that while Dad's work had cultural value, the specific piece in question was too recent and too localized to qualify for official protection. I stood up, Dad's old rental receipt in my hand. But instead of legal documents, I pulled out something else: a photograph of Dad teaching my daughter Sarah to carve wood during her last visit. She couldn't have been more than 8, tiny hands guided by his weathered fingers, both of them covered in sawdust and smiling. "Karen's right," I said. "The Heritage Review didn't protect my sculpture, but it did something else. It showed this community who my father really was." I nodded to Mrs. Henderson, who stood and held up a photograph of Richard Henderson and my father at a community art fair, surrounded by families admiring their work. "My husband believed art made communities stronger," she said, voice trembling but clear. "Karen Stewart believes profit makes communities stronger. Tonight, you choose which vision you want for our neighborhood." That's when Jim Murphy stood up with a wooden chess set Dad had made for his grandson. Then Pete with a memorial plaque Dad had carved for his wife's garden. Then neighbors I barely knew, each holding something my father had created with his hidden artist's hands. "You want to tear down Tom's eagle?" called out Bob Martinez, the same man who deposed me just weeks earlier. "Fine, But first, explain why we should trust someone who's been lying about development deals and trying to steal community land for personal profit. Karen's face flushed red. Those are baseless accusations. Really? I pulled out Richard Henderson's letters and the development proposal. Because I have documentation going back 20 years showing your plans to eliminate art spaces for commercial development. Plans that make you a lot of money if they succeed. The room erupted. Neighbors who'd supported Karen because they trusted her leadership suddenly understood they'd been manipulated. The woman who'd positioned herself as the defender of community values had been selling out that community for decades. "Let's vote," Karen said desperately. "All in favor of immediate sculpture removal." 12 hands went up, in a room of over 80 people. All opposed? A forest of hands filled the air. Even some of Karen's closest allies voted against her. But the real victory came after the meeting when Sarah called me from college. "Dad, I saw the video someone posted from tonight's meeting. I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm proud of what you did." The sculpture still stands in my front yard, and probably always will. Karen Stewart resigned from the HOA board the next week, citing irreconcilable differences with current community direction. The development deal fell through when the county refused to rezone protected art space. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evening, looking at Dad's eagle and thinking about the workshop full of beautiful things he never told me about how we all hide parts of ourselves we think the world won't understand or appreciate. The neighborhood's different now. People stop by to see the sculpture, to hear about the arts cooperative, to share their own creative projects. Mrs. Henderson opened her husband's files to anyone researching local history. The community garden planted native plants around the eagle, turning it into an informal memorial to local artists. Karen was right about one thing. That sculpture did change our neighborhood, just not the way she expected. It reminded us that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight costs you everything you thought you wanted. And sometimes, especially then, you discover what you actually need. The eagle spreads its wings against the morning sky, exactly where it belongs.